Hello, my name is Jake Douglas, Spoon River College, and this is Business 250, Principles of Microeconomics. We're going to talk about Chapter 3, Supply and Demand. Let's go ahead and get started. So imagine you're going to build a house. Your plans are drawn up, the land is purchased, and you are all set to begin construction. What is the first thing you do? Do you immediately start putting up walls, painting them, putting in the furniture and decorations? Of course not. Before you can do any of that, you must build a foundation. Economics is no different. Before we can understand the complex economic concepts, we need a foundation. Supply and demand analysis, our foundation, will explain how market economics work. We are going to get into the details of economics. In the United States economy, most goods and services are bought and sold through private markets. Electronics, airplane tickets, concert tickets, getting a haircut, these are all private markets. And there is usually a large variety in these markets. You get a lot of choices, which is good. If you've been around Canton, Illinois for very long, think about how many fast food restaurants there are. Choices are good. Prices are determined by what people are willing to pay. But what are the factors that determine markets' changes? What is happening when a market event occurs that changes prices? Supply and demand analysis helps us understand these questions, including why product sales go up and down, the direction they move, and how many products are offered for sale at any given time. Markets are institutions that bring buyers and sellers together so that they can interact and transact with each other. Emphasis on the transaction. A market must have a transaction to be a market. While all markets have transactions, most are different from one another. Some markets sell many products, some only a few, or some just one, when we call that specialization, back from Chapter 1. Geographical location plays a large part on markets' limitations. Online retailers have few, if any, geographical limitations. Anyone with an internet connection can access this type of market, and the online retailer is really only limited to their transportation costs to get their products to their customers. A garbage collection company is more limited to only a local area, as it would not be cost effective from them to drive their trucks across the nation to collect garbage. So let's talk about a price system. A price system is when buyers and sellers exchange money for stuff. They're also accepting some offers and rejecting others. What they're really doing is communicating their wants and needs, and they communicate that through the price of products. If I buy a product, I value it. If I don't buy it, I don't think it's worth the price. So prices give a buyer an easy means of comparing products that substitute for each other. A price system is a name given to the market economy because prices provide considerable information to buyers and sellers. We call a market economy a price system because price is a priority. If skim milk is $2 a gallon and whole milk is $4 a gallon, this gives the buyer an easy comparison of two products that really give us the same thing, milk. Maybe there are other factors that impact your decision. You like the taste of whole milk over skim, or you want more calories in your milk. But the first thing a buyer is going to look at is the price when comparing the two of similar items. So sellers can also compare prices to determine what they want to sell. When the price rises for iPhones, this is telling phone stores that consumers want more iPhones, so they order more to meet demand, and they make more money for it. So think about it. If the price goes down on the iPhone, that means the manufacturer is trying to increase their demand. Sure, if you lower the price, you'll get more buyers, but that doesn't mean there's high demand for the product. Rather, the demand is low. When you buy a product, you're voting with your money. Economists focus on wants, not needs, because it's hard to identify what everyone needs. When you buy something, you are selecting one product out of many and supporting one business out of many. In a broader sense, you're also telling the business community what type of product satisfies your needs. The desires consumers have for specific products, which they express through buying, are known as demands. So let's go over the definition of demand. Economics has its own definition of demand. Demand is the maximum amount of a product that buyers are willing and able to buy over a period of time at different prices, with all things held constant. The law of demand tells us that as the price of a product goes up, the quantity, the demand goes down. As the price of a product goes down, quantity demanded increases, all things held constant. So remember, this is relation to price only. There are many factors that go into what people demand, and price is just one of them, but it's a big one and typically the most important. So think about a movie or video game or Xbox or TV over the years. Over time, people move on to new movies or games or consoles or TVs, and the demand for the old products go down. So what do the manufacturers do if they still carry these products and they need to sell them? They decrease the price to increase demand. Now my favorite movie is only $3 to stream instead of $10 when it was new, so I'm going to buy it. That's the law of demand. The law of demand is something that economists can chart, and we call this chart the demand curve, which is the graph that we see. The photo on this slide is an example of the demand curve. The curve slopes always down and to the right. The price of the product is always on the y-axis, and the quantity of the product is always on the x-axis. So let's take a look at an example of a demand chart. So you are a McDonald's customer and you love Big Macs. You like to buy at least one every week, but depending on the price of each Big Mac is how many you're going to buy in that given week. So in the chart, we can see a few things. The highest price you'll pay is $20 for a Big Mac. Anything higher, you're not going to buy a single one for the week. That's too much money for you. The lowest price you'll pay is $1 for a Big Mac. If it was free, you'd get unlimited, obviously, and this graph wouldn't even be important. So we're going to see 20 points on the curve, and each point represents a combination of price and quantity, which is also what our data shows here. So we took the data from our spreadsheet, Excel, and we turned it into a line graph. So for the top left, we can see that at $20 per Big Mac, you're going to buy one Big Mac that week and no more. That's your budget. On the far end to the right, we can see that at $1 per Big Mac, here's the price, go all the way over, and you're going to see you're going to buy 20 Big Macs for that week. Everything in the middle is a combination of price and number of Big Macs. So this is a very basic example of a demand chart and curve. So let's take a look at another one. So you have a $100 budget per month for streaming subscriptions, and you want to know how many you can buy each month. So in the chart above, we can see a few things. We have our price of subscriptions on the left, and we have our quantity of subscriptions on the bottom on the x-axis. We can see here that the highest price you will pay for all of your subscriptions is $100. Anything more than that, you simply are not going to buy one. You're over budget. The lowest price you'll pay for a subscription is $20. Subscriptions have a price, and this is the cheapest you can find on the market. They're not free, obviously. So you're going to see 5 points on this curve, and each point represents a combination for price and quantity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So from the top left, we can see that at $100 per subscription, you're going to only buy one subscription. You've used all of your budget. On the far end to the right, we can see that at $20 per subscription, you're going to buy 5 subscriptions. Everything in the middle is a combination of price and number of subscriptions. So remember, this is the price of the product when all other things are held constant. There are no other factors at play here, only how much the subscriptions cost. So what determines demand? So up until now, we've only discussed price and how it affects quantity, but there are other factors that also affect demand. So we have what we call the determinants of demand, which are 5 key non-price factors that affect demand. Our first one is tastes and preferences. So simply put, we prefer some products over others due to quality or style or something new or it's new. Nike versus Reebok versus Adidas versus Under Armour versus Fila. Everyone has different tastes. Not everybody only likes one of these brands. And we call those fads, which is short-lived enthusiasm. Something new is usually more in demand than something older. Tastes and preferences. Number 2 is income. Usually more income means demand goes up. You have more money to buy stuff. And we can break down goods into 2 different types. We have what we call normal goods, which is a product that when income increases, demand for that also increases. So we like to think of maybe a new house, a new car, new technology. When you make more money, the demand for those particular items goes up because you can afford them now. Those are normal goods. Inferior goods is a product that when income increases, demand goes down. So a couple examples of that would be public transportation, riding the bus or riding the train. As your income goes up, now I can afford my own car, I can afford my own transportation. I don't need to use the public transportation anymore. So my income has went up, the demand for this product goes down. Same thing with ramen noodles. Us as college students know that ramen is super cheap, super easy to make, but eventually when you make more money as an adult, you're not hopefully not going to buy as much ramen. Again, more income means you can afford other things. The demand for ramen goes down. Number three, the price of related goods. So prices of related goods, we can break that down into two different goods. We have what we call substitute goods, which are products consumers will substitute for one another depending on price. When the price of one product rises and demand of a different product rises, both of them are substitute goods. So something we could think about is, let's say, football games and baseball games. Let's say the price of football games continues to go up. Uh, Now the demand for baseball games is also going to go up. Why? Because people don't want to pay as much money for a football game. Remember, law of demand, price goes up, demand goes down for football. But baseball is a substitute good. So as the price goes up for football games, your demand for baseball is going to go up too because that price hasn't changed. Another thing to think about for substitute goods is gas and solar power. As the price of gas-related goods increases, people are going to start demanding more solar power. Why? Because it's cheaper. Complementary goods, on the other hand, are products that are usually consumed together. So when the price of one product rises and the demand of another product goes down, both of them are complementary goods. So let's think about going to the movies, and usually if you go, you have soda and popcorn with your movie. So when the price of uh, one product rises and the demand of another product goes down, both are complementary goods. So as the price of movies goes up, the demand of soda and popcorn is going to go down. Why? Because movies and soda and popcorn all go together. Same thing with hot dogs and buns. As the prices of hot dogs increase, the demanded quantity of buns is going to go down. Why? Because they go hand in hand. They're complementary. Number four, the number of buyers. The more potential buyers are in an area, the higher the demand. And as an example, as people live longer, medical services come into higher demand. So if you're a potential hospital looking to establish a new facility, you're going to want to go where the people are, where there's the number of buyers. That's going to increase your demand. Number five, expectations. Um, Incomes rise, natural disasters occur, new laws and regulations are on the horizon, or there's an expected shortage of products or materials. All four of those are just examples of expectations that are going to be changing demand. So how is the demand curve affected? Earlier we just saw a demand curve which was one slope going down and to the right. But when these five determinants change, when these are non-price factors, the entire slope is going to shift. It's either going to go right or left. If there's an increase in demand, the slope is going to shift to the right. Why? Because we see here on the right, the new slope on the right-hand side. As it shifts to the right, we can see on our x-axis the quantity of ice cream cones. That's going to go up. On the flip side, if there's a decrease in demand, the slope is going to shift to the left. There is a decrease in the quantity demanded, slope shifts left. So a major business closes in town and 100 workers are laid off and have lowered their incomes. Remember, income is a determinant of demand. For new car demand in the area, do you think the demand is going to shift to the right or the left? Well, we just have 100 workers now laid off with no future income. So demand for new cars is going to go down. There's going to be a decrease in demand. So the determinant of demand was income. It's going down, so there's going to be a decrease in demand. Another example would be Samsung rolling out a new iPhone. I'm sorry, a new phone with a new AI feature that everyone seems to want. So for phone demand at the local phone store, will the demand shift left or right? Well, demand for these phones is going to go up because of technology, a new feature. So demand goes up because the determinant of demand also went up. Last example we use, a hurricane is expected to hit Florida and Georgia in the next 7 days. So bottled water is always in short supply during that time. Demand is going to go up at the grocery stores. Do you think that's going to shift the demand curve to the left or the right? It's going to go right because, again, there's going to be an increase in demand. So when these five determinants change and the demand curve changes, we call that changes in demand. Remember, this has nothing to do with price. Changes in demand are only about the determinants of demand, not the price. On the other hand, changes in quantity demanded occurs when the price of a product changes, so that is only about price. That means the demand curve doesn't shift, the changes occur along the original curve. Remember, an analysis of a market economy rests on two foundations, supply and demand, and we just covered demand. Supply is the maximum amount of a product that sellers are willing and able to provide for sale over a period of time at different prices, all things held constant. So demand, we're talking about buyers. Supply, we are talking about sellers. Law of demand has a rule, and the law of supply also has a rule. The law of supply tells us that as prices increase, the amount supplied from the sellers also increases. As prices go down, so too does the amount supplied by the sellers, all things held constant. So think about it. If prices are high, sellers want to produce more because they make more money that way. When prices go down, sellers don't want to produce as much because they may lose money. That's the law of supply. So just like the law of demand can be graphed with the demand curve, we can graph the law of supply. And this graph is called the supply curve. We notice that it goes right and up and to the right. So note the difference in similarity between the demand curve and the supply curve. Both curves have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis, and both curves also move left to right. However, the demand curve always goes down and the supply curve always goes up. The law of demand tells us that as the price goes down, quantity consumed goes up. As we see the price lowering, quantity increases. On the flip side, the law of supply tells us that as the price goes up, sellers supply more. So as the price goes up, quantity also goes up. So the supply curve explained, the higher the price of a Big Mac, the more a supplier is going to make. Why? Because they'll make more money. Well, who sets the price? Well, the market determines the price. McDonald's will make their own price, and then the buyers will determine whether that's an appropriate price or not and adjust accordingly. And we see here as the price of Big Macs continue to increase, now we're at $5 a Big Mac, $10 a Big Mac, $20 a Big Mac. The quantity keeps going up. McDonald's is going to make more as the price goes higher. So remember earlier, there are 5 determinants of demand. Well, now we also have 6 determinants of supply. And they are production technology, costs of resources, prices of other commodities, expectations, the number of sellers, taxes and subsidies, and these are all determinants of supply that are non-price. These are not related to price at all. Determinants of supply. So let's talk about technology. So imagine that you're a baker. Your ovens can bake 50 loaves of bread each hour. Your business buys newer ovens, new technology, and it's improved. Now you can make 100 loaves of bread each hour. So what happened? Technology changed, and technology can change your output. In this particular case, it would increase supply. Cost of resources. Remember, resources can be land and people too. So for this example, your baking business buys yeast for $10 per pound from a warehouse. Well, now the warehouse changes the cost per pound to $12. They've increased it. So this change of resource can affect how much you supply to customers. More than likely, your supply is going to go down because now money, that $2 extra that could have went towards anything else in your business, now it has to go towards yeast. And unless you make more money and sell more baked goods, that's going to affect your supply. And it's going to go down. The prices of other commodities. So in your bakery, you also use cornmeal for baking. Well, the price of soybeans is really high in Illinois, so farmers are going to be planting more beans than corn this year. Let's say in this particular example, they take it to the extreme. All they do is plant beans. And farmers can't just create more land to plant corn now. They can only pick one or the other. So the supply of corn will be affected because of this example, and this can affect the supply of your cornmeal in the future. If there's only soybeans available, the prices of those other commodities from the farmers, they've chosen beans, so now your supply of corn is going to be affected. And just like in demand determinant, expectations. The newest iPhone will come out soon. There's an expectation that demand will be very high compared to other years because of a new camera in it. So Apple may change their supply knowing this expectation of high demand. And number of sellers, back to your bakery, a new bakery comes into your town. So your town's supply of bread has now went up, whether you wanted it to or not. You're not going to make less bread because a new bakery's shown up. No, your supply is probably going to stay the same. However, this new bakery is going to have their own supply. Well, combined together with your bakery, there's an increase in supply in the local economy. More sellers, more supply. And finally, taxes and subsidies. So that new bakery that came into town, your county was offering a $10,000 grant to new businesses that opened in your area. So this subsidy increased the supply in your area. The subsidy brought in a new seller, and because of that, now your supply has increased of bread in the area. So an increase in property taxes on your bakery may also affect supply. An increased cost in taxes will make your supply go down. Why? Because the money that could have went to making bread now goes to taxes. So now your supply goes down. You don't have as much money for your bread making. So just like changes in demand, when any of the determinants of supply change, the supply curve shifts left or right. If there is a shift to the left, that means there is a decrease in supply. As we see here, the left curve, we see that the quantity is less than the main curve, so that it has went down. On the flip side, a shift to the right means that there is an increase in the supply. And remember again, any shifts of curves, whether it be supply or demand, has nothing to do with price. It only has to do with the determinants of demand. So a couple examples here, using the corn and beans example from earlier. If there is a drought in a region and the cost of water and irrigation increases, supply is going to go down as farmers try to meet the new costs of bringing water in to keep their crops hydrated. Supply goes down, the curve is going to shift to the left, the supply of corn and beans. So let's say that that drought is now over, and now there's new research and technology that has been developed to make a drought-resistant seed for both corns and beans. Well, this resistant seed will increase yields and supply. Well, now we have an increase in supply. Why? Determinant of demand has changed for the better. So changes in supply are caused by non-price factors. The curve shifts left or right. A change in quantity supplied means that it's caused by a price change and it moves along the existing curve. There is no new curve made when there is a change in quantity supplied, just like there is no new curve when there is a change in quantity demanded either. Quantity being the key word. So equilibrium is when market forces, supply and demand, are in balance. The quantities demanded by consumers are equal to the quantities supplied by producers. And this is a good thing because everyone is generally satisfied. Now, the equilibrium price is the exact price where equilibrium is achieved. So here in this example, our equilibrium price is going to be right here, right in the middle of the x. And the equilibrium quantity is also at the x. So we see where our supply curve and our demand curve meet. The intersection where they meet, we're going to look at the price, we're going to look at the quantity, and that is our equilibrium. And equilibrium is really a balancing act between consumers and suppliers. So in reality, no market has perfect equilibrium, but if economy is trending towards suppliers and consumers both being happy, then the economy will do well. Equilibrium is a long game, and you can think of it as the average level of prices against quantities. So a phone store that sells close to 100 phones for about the same price every month over a 6-month period is going to have better equilibrium than a store that sells 50 phones one month, they change the price, then they sell 150, they change the price, etc. Consistency is key, and if you're a potential buyer, you usually appreciate consistency more than you would prefer the first phone store over the second one. Equilibrium price is also called the market price. So if you see the term market price anywhere in your future, what we are talking about is the equilibrium price, where supply and demand meet on a curve. The price the market has set, market price. So Adam Smith, who we talked about in Chapter 1, thought that free markets gradually move to equilibrium on their own without the help from outside forces, such as the government. When we have too much of a product or not enough, we can get surpluses and shortages. Surpluses occur when the quantity supplied by sellers exceeds the quantity demanded by buyers. There is too much product out there. That's a surplus. Shortages occur when the quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. There is not enough product out there and buyers demand more. So in the chart, we can see a demand curve and a supply curve in one chart. The demand curve is going down to the right, the supply curve is going up and to the right, and they meet at one point our equilibrium, or also known as our market price. So in the example above, our equilibrium is 600 million gallons of gas being produced at $1.40 per gallon. That's our equilibrium market price. Consumers are not demanding more, and suppliers are not creating more. But what if the supplier produces too much? Now we have excess gasoline, and we call that a surplus. Suppliers will now most likely stop producing as much because they can't sell all the gas that they already have on an inventory that they're producing. And surpluses are always going to be above the equilibrium. On the flip side, if a producer doesn't make enough gasoline, now there is a shortage. The producer will attempt to produce more gas some way to meet demand. In most cases of shortages, prices will go up because consumers are willing to pay more for something that is in short supply. On the other hand, when there is too much of a product in the market, the price will go down because producers want to sell their extra products, so they lower the price to attract the buyers. They don't want to carry the inventory. So buyers and sellers continuously make transactions in this market in the hopes that the market will achieve equilibrium. This is the invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about in Chapter 1. The free market buys and sells on its own to get to a point where everyone is happy, or at least tries to be. Free markets tend to fix their surplus and shortage problems quickly. Long-term shortages and surpluses are usually the result of government regulations or laws in the market. And we see here that surpluses are always going to be shown as above the equilibrium price. Shortages are always going to be below the equilibrium price. So let's briefly talk about Alfred Marshall. He was considered the father of supply and demand in modern times. Much like what we're studying in this course, his ideas are the foundation of what we're studying today. All leading economists in the late 1800s and early 1900s during his teaching days were his students at some point. He did develop the ideas of the laws of supply and demand and the changes in price affecting changes in quantities. The law of demand, the law of supply, what we just went over. This is the guy that thought up those ideas. So what happens when those determinants of supply and demand change? Well, we know that the demand curve is going to shift to the left or the right, but how does that affect the equilibrium? Well, the equilibrium is going to shift as well, the market price. In the examples shown, a change in supply, could be from technology, expectations, or any other determinant that we discussed, has moved to the left, so there is less supply. Since we have a new supply curve, the equilibrium shifts to the new supply curve. So in this example, demand hasn't changed from any non-price factors, so there's only going to be one demand line. There's no determinants of demand have not changed, only the determinants of supply. So the supply curve moves, demand stays the same. However, the new equilibrium is now where the demand curve crosses with the new supply curve. There is less supply, so now the price has increased and the demand has decreased because of the determinants of supply change. The same thing applies to changes in demand, such as income or buyer preferences. In the example shown, demand has increased because of one of these types of changes. Supply has not changed from any non-price factors, so there's only going to be one supply curve, but now we have two demand curves. D1 has shifted now to D2. So what happens? The demand has shifted, and so the equilibrium also shifts. Now we see the new equilibrium. Quantity has increased, people want more, and now suppliers increase the price, knowing that people will pay for it. But everyone is satisfied at the new equilibrium because of the determinant of change. The determinant of supply has changed. When supply and demand both change, understanding the effects can be tricky. So the figure in our textbook, which we see here, gives some examples of what can happen when both supply and demand, those determinants both change. So in all of these graphs, both supply and demand have increased. You'll notice that in all four graphs, the supply curve is shifted to the right and the demand curve is shifted to the right. So there's been an increase in both. In the first graph, the largest one, point E is the old equilibrium, where the old supply and demand meet, and point A is the new equilibrium, where the two curves meet, the new ones. But depending on how supply increases and how demand increases, that can affect the equilibrium. And in some cases, the equilibrium doesn't change at all. So as you can see in the three smaller graphs, the equilibrium points are in different locations. And this is due to the differences in the increases. This all looks really confusing, so let's make it just one point. When supply and demand both change, finding the equilibrium can be very unclear and very hard to predict. So if free markets are left to themselves, prices are established between buyers and sellers, and there are no surpluses or shortages. But there are some instances where consumers still feel the equilibrium price isn't fair. And when that happens, the government steps in. Now keep in mind the government doesn't step in due to economic reasons. It's usually for social or political ones. The free markets set the prices. The problem is consumers simply aren't satisfied with what a particular market has set them at. So what does the government do? It'll set price ceilings and price floors. So price ceilings are when the government sets the maximum price that can be charged for a product or service. A common example of a price ceiling is rent control. Governments, usually cities or counties, place rent controls so that landlords cannot charge an exceedingly high price for rent. So this move is a reaction to keep families that cannot afford high rent into their rented homes, which can be a good thing. People need places to live, and some landlords don't treat people very well when it comes to rent prices. So rent control, the idea of it is good. And rent control tends to work well in the short run. Rent remains low. But let's say you're a landlord over 4 apartments. You charge $500 a month to each tenant. So 4 tenants, $500 a month. That's $2,000 total per month for your income as a landlord. Your expenses on the building are $1,000 a month. So you get $2,000 in income minus $1,000 in costs. So you get a net income of $1,000. Your local government then puts in place a rent control law that you can never charge more than $500 a month, which, hey, that's what you're already charging, so that's not a big deal, right? Well, if you're the landlord, what happens when the prices of things go up around you, which they inevitably will due to inflation? Food, other services, gasoline, utilities, everything goes up in price around you, but you can't make any more income from your apartments. You can't charge more. You're not allowed to. So what do? Well, eventually, you'll probably find ways to either cut costs or even get out of the rental business altogether because it may no longer be profitable to you, the landlord. Maybe you'll change the rentals into condominiums, which people buy and own. You buy a condo, you do not rent one. So now you're out of the rental game entirely. Now you've just sold your unit. So maybe you won't repair your apartments as much when things are broken to save costs. Do you think a landlord is going to reduce their standard of living? No, they're going to keep doing what they do to keep what they already have to take care of themselves and their own families. And I think any of us would want to do that. So what about people that want to be landlords and own rental properties? They're going to see the rent controls in place. And do you think they want to build new buildings in that area? Well, not if other cities allow them to increase rent as necessary. So this isn't a knock on tenants that rent apartments. There's two sides of this issue, and renters are important also. They need the affordable housing. But understand that the rental market will change around them, and other potential renters aren't going to have the rent control price that somebody under rent control already has. And the key about price ceilings is that they are meant to keep prices down and below the market value. But in most cases, when a price ceiling goes into effect on a product, there will eventually be a shortage of it because sellers are going to try to get out of that market. They're not going to see the product as profitable, so they're going to leave. Our case study this week is on price ceilings and rent control to understand it better, and so this is going to be an important topic in 2024. So just to reiterate here, when the price ceiling goes into effect on our product, there will eventually be a shortage of it. Why? Because sellers are going to try to get out of the market, and as sellers leave, supply goes down. Price floors are when a government sets the minimum price that can be charged for a product or service. A great example of a price floor is the minimum wage. Minimum wage has a federal rate and a state rate. In 2024, the federal United States rate is $7.25 per hour. However, in the state of Illinois, the state where Spoon River College resides, the state rate is $14, which trumps the federal wage. It's going to go up to $15 per hour starting on January 1st of 2025. The minimum wage is the lowest amount any company is required to pay a worker in that state, in particular our state. So if they pay less per hour, that's illegal. If a company if minimum wage in Illinois is $14 an hour and a seller tries to hire workers at $12 an hour, they're not allowed to do that. Now, there is a caveat to this, and this is for jobs where you earn tips, like servers at a restaurant. That minimum wage rate is lower, but at least in the state of Illinois, the tips that you make plus your wages still must equal out to 14 an hour, but it's different in every state. So how much people earn will always be a topic in any economy. Governments have set price floors on wages so that people can earn enough money to have a quality standard of living, or at least try to. But as the wage floor increases, companies will react eventually. They may increase their prices for consumers to make up the differences in the increase of wages they now have to pay their workers. They may move their business elsewhere where wages are lower. A business may reduce benefits to its workers, such as health insurance or their 401k. They may simply cut jobs altogether at their company, and now the workers that remain must take on more work. Each company is going to react differently, but it is usually the small businesses that take the brunt of wage increases. Large companies that bring in millions or billions of dollars can adjust to increases in costs much easier than small businesses. Prospective business owners may avoid high wage areas entirely and open a store where their costs are cheaper. Again, talking about equilibrium, it's about finding that balance between buyers and sellers to make everyone satisfied. And in this particular case, it's between business owners and workers. So some final thoughts on Chapter 3 before the work study or case study. Markets are institutions that enable buyers and sellers to interact and transact business with one another. Economies have both supply, what producers offer, and demand, what consumers want. Supply and demand have determinants, which are factors that don't include the price, that affect goods and services both made and consumed. Markets will try to find equilibrium where both producers and consumers are happy. Price ceiling and price floors are set by governments when the government wants to artificially keep prices either above or below equilibrium. And remember, when we talk about demand, we're talking about buyers. When we talk about supply, we are talking about sellers. Okay, our case study for Chapter 3 is going to be the housing market spillover, evidence from the end of rent control in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So our topic is going to be rent control, which we talked about in our lecture, and how it affected a city in the United States for about 25 years. So the history of rent control in the United States. Regulations are widespread in housing markets, and rent controls are arguably among the most important historically. Because they directly manipulate the price mechanism, they are likely to reshape the allocation of residents to locations, the incentives for investment and maintenance of controlled units, and the supply, demand, quality, and allocation of units in the non-controlled sector. So really what this means is rent control manipulates, by manipulating the price, they're also going to reshape where people live, the incentive for people to come and invest in those properties, the maintenance of those properties, and the overall the supply and demand and the quantity provided to tenants in the area. So the modern era of U.S. rent controls began as a part of World War II era price controls and as a reaction to housing shortages following demographic changes immediately after the war. More immigrants showed up. So while the prevalence of rent control as a housing market policy has decreased since this period, rent control and rent stabilization, kind of the same thing, plans are still in place in many U.S. and European cities. New York City's system of rent regulation affects at least 1 million apartments, while cities such as San Francisco, LA, Washington, D.C., and several California and New Jersey cities have various forms of rent regulation. So the study of this report was a large-scale policy change that eliminated rent control in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1995. So from December 1970 through 1994, all rental units in Cambridge built prior to 1969 were regulated by a far-reaching rent control ordinance that placed strict caps on rent increases and tightly restricted the removal of units from the rental market. This legislative intent of the rent control ordinance was to provide affordable rental housing, and at the eve of rent control's elimination in 1994, controlled units typically rented at 40% or higher below the price of nearby non-controlled properties, though maintenance and the amenities in those rent-controlled units tended to be subpar. Cambridge's initial rent control policy, adopted in 1970, applied to all non-owner occupied housing rental housing built before the year 1969. So it did not apply to structures built after January 1, 1969, to owner-occupied condominiums or to non-residential structures converted to rental properties after this time. So oversight of the rent control law rested with the Cambridge Rent Control Board, whose official charter was to ensure that landlords obtained a fair net operating income. And the board established maximum allowable rents for each controlled property with the aim of fixing landlord net operating income at inflation-adjusted 1967 levels. In the 1970s and 1980s, the board authorized a series of across-the-board rent increases ranging from 1.15 to 3.1%, intended to cover increases in heating costs, operating costs, and property taxes. So the city of Cambridge did allow landlords to increase their prices over time, but they had a strict cap on it. Landlords could also apply to raise prices above those scheduled increases, but these variances were rarely sought or granted in practice, in part because the application required supporting petitions, extensive legal documentation, and significant time investment. So landlords could have applied to charge higher rents, but the work was intense to even get to that point to even get it approved, time and money. In 1994, 22% of all residential structures and 38% of all residential units fell under this rent control law. Keep in mind, this rent control policy was not based on tenants' income. The rent control was applied to certain residential buildings built before a certain year, and not the people that lived in them. So there were many middle and upper income families that lived in these areas too, that also received the benefit of rent control. So distinct from many cities, Cambridge's rent control policy did not allow for so-called vacancy decontrol, whereby controlled rental units were returned to market rate rents after protected tenants moved out. Landlords therefore faced an incentive to remove units from the rental stock, which they accomplished by converting substantial numbers of rental units to condominiums and selling them to owner occupants. So what we have here is that as soon as these tenants that were protected by rent control left, landlords would argue that they could now charge any new tenants the market rate instead of the rent controlled rate. So to prevent the controlled rental stock from being depleted, in 1979 the City Council passed the Removal Permit Ordinance, which substantially restricted the removal of controlled units from the rental stock and complicated the conversion of controlled units into owner-occupied condominiums. So these landlords were frustrated that they had to continuously provide rent-controlled prices. It didn't matter which tenants moved in and out, and so they tried to sell their units outright to get out of the rental business. Well, the city of Cambridge did not like that, so they put in place an ordinance which restricted these landlords' abilities to turn their rentals into condominiums. And here's a map of Cambridge. All of the dark black circles were all buildings in the city that were subject to rent control. So in 1994, the opponents of rent control policies in Massachusetts placed a referendum question on the November general election ballot that asked voters whether to eliminate rent control ordinances and laws in cities and towns across the state, including Cambridge. This state referendum to ban rent controls actually passed by a 51 to 49% margin. And from the reading that I have, the research I've done, this was a very big surprise. Many people were not, citizens in Massachusetts were not expecting this to pass. It did pass. So now rent control is gone. So just prior to the elimination of rent control in 1995, controlled units typically rented at 25 to 40% below the prices of nearby uncontrolled units, which was a clear benefit to tenants in those units. They were being charged less rent. But valuations of rent-controlled units, the value of the buildings themselves, were significantly lower than non-controlled units. And the evidence indicates that ownership investments in those rent-controlled units, which include the maintenance, the upkeep, and the capital improvements, were lower than the investments in those non-controlled units. So landlords were putting less money into their buildings on those buildings that were rent-controlled. So immediately following rent decontrol, rents at formerly controlled units in Cambridge increase steeply. So the rent control goes away, the rent prices go up sharply. Simultaneously, residential turnover rose sharply, with the sharpest increases occurring at decontrolled units as tenants relocated in the face of rising rents. So not only did rent go up, Turnover, meaning new residents coming in, old residents leaving, that also increased, again, due to rising rents. Over the next several years, however, direct dollar investments in these housing units, as measured by building permit filings, more than doubled on an annual basis. So, uh, the good and the bad. The bad was rent prices went up, which is bad if you're a tenant. On top of that, a lot of renters left, again due to those prices. On the flip side of that, from a business side, building permits doubled. So now more investors and more landlords were wanting to come into the area to either one, improve their current buildings, or two, build new ones entirely. So they're bringing in more money through the area. So essentially, when rent controls went into effect, landlords and building owners didn't maintain their buildings as well as they did prior, as they couldn't afford to. As the prices around them went up, their income stayed the same. So they let their buildings deteriorate, or they sold their buildings or turned them into other types of buildings besides rentals. Now you have less housing for people that rent. So if those landlords get rid of their rentals entirely, that's actually decreasing the supply in the area, which is not good for renters. Now they have less choices. So when maintenance levels went down to these buildings, the renters left because their standard of living went down as well. And remember, some of these renters were also middle income and high income earners. So they were used to a standard of living that they were now not receiving. When those middle income and high income earners left, their incomes left the area also. So in return, low income residents moved into the area. Now, low income residents themselves are not a problem, but their low incomes were to Cambridge. That's because these low incomes were taxed less by the local governments. Well, what do taxes pay for? Government services. So now the government is receiving less taxes from its citizens because there are lower earners in the area, and now these government agencies in that area lost revenue to pay for services to the community, like keeping up with parks, providing monetary assistance for low-income earners, healthcare services, etc. Well, eventually these low-income residents, no different than the high-income earners, then also left the rent-controlled area. Their government amenities went down, and they wanted to go to areas with better building maintenance and amenities. So over time, even these low-income earners were not satisfied with the maintenance of the buildings and the amenities provided by the local community. So they left, and they left also. So this will eventually get to the point where you have substandard housing, and the values of every building in the area will go down, and now it's hard to get people in there, renters. So if you're an investor, would you want to invest your money in this type of area? An area that is not growing and you have no incentive to improve the buildings or increase your business? And it's tough to say it's all about the money, but it kind of is. There was less money flowing through these rent-controlled areas, and everyone in the areas paid for it. So the main estimates imply that during the rent control area, rent controlled properties were valued at 45 to 50% lower value relative to the properties that were never controlled by Cambridge. So after the rent control policy was removed in 1994, here's what happened. The building values went up, not only in the rent controlled areas, but also the non-rent controlled areas. So not even the areas outside of rent control were also uh, positively affected. Investors started to bring more money to the area. Now more money flowed through the local economy, which was a good thing for the city itself. New buildings were constructed, increasing building permits in the area, which is more money for the government. Now they can provide adequate services to their citizens. And this also increased the supply of units, which is a good thing. Now we have more units available to renters. A couple bad things which we touched on. Rents, of course, went up, which is not always a good thing for low-income renters, and the resident turnover increased, which is not always a good thing. But residents did begin to move back into these decontrolled areas. And with all that said, remarkably, Cambridge has attempted to bring back rent controls many times since 1994, but these measures have been defeated every time on the municipal level. They don't even get to the point to be voted on. So some final thoughts on the rent control uh, case study at Cambridge. Good intentions like rent control can have a negative effect on the economy where the changes are made if the policy is not well implemented. Short-term gains can turn into long-term losses for an economy, and government intervention can hurt free markets. And that concludes chapter 3.